Now, one idea is to play king f8 and get your king here. Still, g6 is perhaps possible. You know, if you go here, you might want to play rook b1, but then there is rook a5 and the rook is entering via this side. So you don't want to do this. So he played the move king f8, and now comes the move g5. He gains further space on the king side, and he is angling to sort of put pressure on these pawns. I think it's a good time to actually push the pawn to g6 now for Magnus. He's trying to move the knight, but that could be a mistake. Oh, maybe he wants to go knight e7 to trade the knights. No, he plays knight c7, and this is a big mistake. Look at Vincent's expressions carefully. He looks at the position very with deep concentration, and he looks at Magnus and then looks at a distance and then again sits back in his chair and then comes in. He knows that knight d6 is now very strong because it attacks b7 and also the f7 point with rook f5 coming. It's actually a very powerful move. So Vincent, after having a good look at his opponent, plays the move knight d6. Very powerful. Now, if you look at Magnus, he's not yet understood that his last move was a blunder. If you look at him, he's still pretty cool, calm, composed, and he's looking at what should he play as his next move here. His idea was this move rook b1, and if he plays it, he does defend b7, but what about rook to f5? Putting pressure here, he can't defend. And look, he even moves his hand to the rook and then stops and then suddenly notices, oh my god, rook f5 is coming. What am I going to do if I play rook b1? And now Magnus's expressions completely change at this point. He starts looking there. He's realized he's gone wrong and now tries to focus hard, shaking his head there. This is what happens when chess players, even to the best of the best in the business, the position was equal, but a lapse in concentration and suddenly you are in trouble. And look at Vincent. His confidence keeps rising. Magnus can't believe what he has just done. From a completely fine position, just one move has shifted everything in his opponent's favor. He's trying his best to see what is the way in which he can create maximum play. Knight e6 was one of his ideas why he wanted to play his knight to c7, but now after rook f5 or even rook e5, which is a very powerful move because now b7 is hanging, and if you try to defend it, there's already this amazing move g6 just hacking at the structure and the knight is hanging. Magnus is sitting there with his head in his hands. He just doesn't know what to do. Now he's just sort of, it's a nightmare for a strong player, because from a completely fine position, when you land into this situation, you just don't want to play. And there you have it. Magnus says, I don't want to play this position anymore. That's the kind of expression. But chess makes you take up sort of responsibility for your decision, and Magnus has to make his next move. He has to play something. He has still 37 minutes on the clock. Vincent has 6 minutes. We are just 3 moves away from reaching move 40. I guess either you want to defend b7, but then this is hanging on f7, or you want to stop rook f5, you want to play the move g6. Magnus has been thinking for a good 10-15 minutes now. He's down to 32 minutes on the clock and finally makes this decision of playing the move g6, just dropping one full pawn on b7, and this is not an ordinary pawn. Once you take it, c6 is weak. That would mean you would be 2 pawns down. Vincent instantly chops off the pawn. Now, if it were a lesser player than Vincent, of course Magnus would have still given a very strong resistance. But with Vincent, it's very tough. He is a world-class GM. And after rook b8, now here's an example, like what would you play here with your knight? My first instinct was knight a5, putting pressure here, but you know, Vincent actually finds a very, very interesting idea. He goes knight d8 and he attacks the pawn from here and also keeps an eye on the f7 pawn. But Magnus has another plan, which is to go rook b5. Now, if you were to take here, then after rook c5, dc5, knight e6, this is actually very close to a draw. So this you cannot fall into. And if you take rook takes c6, then after rook g5, also you might drop the pawn. I mean, it's still better for white. The best move here, and a very, very difficult move, and Vincent only has 20 seconds to play this. This is the 40th move, is to take, and after pawn takes, to go knight c6 and stop the pawn. Then you have 4 pawns versus 2. And Vincent actually finds it. He plays this move, c takes b5 played. It is the 41st move now. Magnus will get more than an hour, like he's on 33, so he'll have 1 hour 3 minutes. Vincent plays knight c6 to stop the pawn, gets up from the chair. Also Magnus gets up, he's unhappy. Both players leave the board. They're like, we don't want to play this position. Vincent wants a break from that intense time trouble. Magnus went and grabbed a bite. He has a new task at hand. The task is to somehow survive in this knight endgame. 4 pawns versus 2. It seems almost impossible to do it, because if the white knight is stopping this pawn, then these pawns will just start rolling. For example, if Magnus plays knight d5 with the aim of pushing the pawn here, then king f3, b4 pawn push, and now knight a5, the knight stops the pawn here. So in a way it's not so easy. Magnus goes king e8 and he says, I'm bringing my king in here. And just learn from Vincent how to play such positions. First, you blockade the pawn. You come back to b4. Next up, you start rolling your kingside pawns. So Magnus now has to decide what his move is. And he plays the move king to e7. He brings his king up. And now with e4, f4, what do you start with is the question. Okay, have to be careful. If a move like e4, suddenly knight e6 double attacks both these pawns. So first f4, just solidifying the entire structure. Now you want to play e4, but when that happens, let's say king d6. Now when e4 is played, you don't want the knight to come and attack both these pawns. So you need your king at that point to be on e3. And that's the reason why Vincent brings his king in. He's bringing all his pieces, and notice how the knight covers this square, pawn covers this square. If Magnus were to play knight d5, then after takes king e2, this is a winning king pawn endgame, because the white king stops these pawns and black king can't do much here. So Magnus goes knight e6. He places his knight on a decent square, and Vincent brings his king to e2. There is definite benefit in playing this in an unhurried fashion. There's no need to hurry. Just be calm. Yes, you are beating the 5-time world champion and also the greatest player on the planet right now, but it's a one game. You don't need to rush, and that's what Vincent is doing right now, playing very calmly. What is Magnus's next decision? He goes knight to g7. He moves his knight away, and now white wants to push the pawn. I think that would be a good idea, because once the knight comes back, then we can play king e3 to defend both the pawns. So pawn up to e4, fantastic move played by white. And now Magnus Carlsen goes knight to h5, attacking the pawn on f4. What does Vincent do now? Maybe just king e3 is fine. You can also go king f3, and he goes king f3. There are still some subtle pitfalls to navigate here for white, but the only thing that could lead to him not winning this is if he hurries. And for an experienced 2700 plus player like Vincent, this is not going to happen. He plays this very calm move, knight to d3. Look, if you play a move like e5, which is looking winning, you are creating some problems for yourself. You know, you're creating this f5 square for the knight. So Vincent actually goes knight d3. Magnus comes back with his knight to h5. And now once again, if you rush with f5, then after g, f, e, f, and maybe, okay, king d5, there might be knight f4, so first knight g7, and unfortunately this can get very, very tricky. So he goes king e3 again, a little waiting move, asking Magnus what is his plan, because now if the king moves away, then d5 check could be possible. Magnus goes with his knight to g3, and a very good move now is pawn up to d5. This semicircular structure is very good because the king is planning to come to d4. He goes king c7, but now king d4 is great, because if you give a check, then the king comes up even further to e5, eventually to f6, and rounds up these two pawns. So he goes king d4, strong move. King moves up the board, and Magnus has to decide how is he planning to continue here. He goes king to b6. Can white now play his king to e5 to f6? Is that safe? Because Magnus now also has a plan to play here. He goes knight e5. This requires some calculation, but Vincent has seen it. b4, now the b pawn is running ahead. So if Magnus tries to go and stop with this king, then he might lose this e4 pawn. So he goes, takes the pawn, Magnus pushes it further. Once again, king c3 would be a blunder because knight e4 leads to a draw. So he goes knight e5, and his point is that you want to give a check when the pawn pushes to b2 and take it. So this pawn is not moving forward, and the knight has come back on time. Knight e2, a check to the king, and so the king goes back, attacking the knight. King e3, and now the king goes to b5. So you could push the pawn down the board to d6, but Vincent plays his knight to d3. Of course, you cannot take this knight right now because b2 would just end the game. So first knight d3, very solid, and Magnus plays his knight to c3, and at this point d6 seems to be the right choice because you're pushing forward. Yes, he pushes his pawn ahead, and if Magnus goes king c6, you can play e5, and if you try knight a4 to push your pawn, then already a very good idea is f5, g takes f5, and g6, and this pawn is queening down the board. So Magnus does go king c6, and I believe Vincent is going to find the move e5 here. Magnus just goes and checks Hikaru's position in the background. e5 played, and next the threat is very powerful. f5 is coming in, and so at this point Magnus has to think what to do. There's nothing much. Vincent has 2 minutes, Magnus has 43 minutes, 44 minutes, and with all this time his position is completely lost. You can see Magnus giving a final look at the board and resigns.